In the summer of 2013, my wife and I were living in Chicago, and we were approaching our third wedding anniversary, and I wanted to do something special, and so I booked us tickets to go on a lunch cruise on Lake Michigan. I'd heard some good things about it. You get to see the Chicago skyline and enjoy some good food. And everything was on track, but a couple days before the cruise, I got a phone call from a woman with the cruise company, and she said, "Hey, Cory, I'm so sorry. We accidentally overbooked your cruise." And I said, "Oh, that's a bummer. What do we do?" And she goes, "Well, I'd be happy to offer you a discount for a different cruise. It's at the exact same time and in the exact same day, if you'd be up for that." And I said, "Sure." She goes, "There's just one thing. It's a gospel cruise. Are you okay with that?" And I said, "Let's go." And so the day comes, and my wife and I get dressed and head to take the L to downtown Chicago. I grabbed a picture from that day. This is us in 2013, just babies. Aren't we cute? This is when my hair was doing a farewell tour, so that's fun. So we go down to Navy Pier, and we get on this boat called the Spirit of Chicago, and we embark on this gospel cruise. Now, friends, when I tell you that we were the only white people on that boat, I mean, we were the only white people on that boat, with one exception, and that was the wait staff, okay, people delivering food and drinks to tables. And so I left Kasha at one point in time to go to the bathroom, and I didn't come back for a very long time. And that's because I kept getting stopped by people. Like, one guy was like, "Hey, could I see a dessert menu?" Somebody else would be like, "More napkins would be great, thanks." One woman put her drink in my hand and said, "Can I get a refill?" And I did. I went and refilled her drink for her. And to be fair, I mean, honestly, I look like a white waiter on a gospel cruise. It's like, let's be honest, we can be honest. But here's the thing, there's a dance floor in the middle of this cruise ship, and people are just packed out on this dance floor, giving their all to gospel praise music, okay? And here's the thing, my wife and I had just graduated from a fairly diverse college that had a gospel choir, and we were both in the gospel choir, and so we knew these songs. And so it's not long before we start clapping and singing along, and people realize, oh, this is not a waiter. And so instead of asking for drink refills, we begin getting invitations to join them on the dance floor. And I tell you what, we had a blast that day. I am so glad that whatever other cruise we had been booked for got overbooked, because we got to spend that day with that crew of people, and I will never forget it. There is maybe nothing more discouraging than feeling like you are on the outside of something or a group of people looking in. And there's maybe nothing that touches deeper than being welcomed in when you were once an outsider and being told you belong here. You are one of us. I got lunch a few weeks ago with a guy in our church, and he said, "Hey, I'd love to get together because I've got some pretty significant doubts. I'm not sure about all the things that we're talking about here." And I just want to say, first of all, I love that about our church, that you can come into this place and you don't have to pretend like you're bought into everything we're talking about here, that it's okay to wrestle with doubts and questions and to be honest about those. You don't have to hide that. So that's what this guy did. So we get lunch, and he says, "I believe in God, and I find Jesus really compelling. I look at his life, and he's inviting people who are on the margins of society. He's helping those who are hurt, in need of healing. He's welcoming the outsider. But then I read the Old Testament, and that God seems just so mean and exclusive, and I can't figure out, are these two really the same?" That's the question that brings us to today. Today we're starting a new series called Outsiders, God's Heart for All People. And over the next 7 weeks, we're going to camp out in the old boat, as it were, and we are going to see that the God of the Old Testament and Jesus are indeed one and the same, and that God's heart for outsiders does not begin in the Gospels, it begins on page 1. In the next several weeks, you're going to hear stories that you may have heard in the past, stories about women like Ruth or Hagar, and then you'll hear stories that maybe you haven't heard, at least in a sermon before, stories like the Gibeonites, the widow of Zarephath, and the queen of Sheba. But today, we're going to begin with a man named Abram. You might know him as Abraham, and he does, in fact, have his name changed later. It's the same guy, but when we meet him here, he's still going by Abram. And we'll get at kind of the reason for the name change in just a little bit. But God has a conversation with this guy Abram that will set the stage for everything else in the Bible. And it's a conversation that picks up in Genesis 12. But before we jump in, just a little bit of context on what's happened so far in the biblical story, just to orient ourselves, okay? So this will be fast. But God creates Adam and Eve, right? Puts them in the garden, and he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, walk with me. Walk faithfully with me. And essentially, they say, no thanks. And sin enters the picture, and they realize they are naked, and then they go hiding from God. And then God says, you can't be in the garden anymore. And then things just continue to go from bad to worse. So Cain kills his brother Abel, and humanity finds itself in this spiral. And so God looks out at the world and says, everybody's just continually doing evil all the time. It's time to start over, clear the deck. And so he sends a flood. But before that, he realizes there's one righteous person, this guy named Noah. And so he decides to spare Noah and his family. Humanity, in the Noah story, gets sort of a mulligan. And then God tells Noah the same thing he tells Adam. He says, hey, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, walk faithfully with me. This is right after the flood had gone away. And by the end of the chapter, with the floodwaters barely gone, Noah gets drunk, passes out, and curses his youngest son. Strong start, right? It's like an episode of Jerry Springer. You don't know, is this Bible or Jerry? And by the way, have you noticed how much nakedness there is in the Bible? Like right off the bat, it's a lot of nakedness. Anyway, so then we get to the Tower of Babel, and humanity stops and says, hey, look, let's park here and let's build a tower that reaches all the way up to heaven just to show how awesome we are. And God says, no thanks, and he scatters them into different nations. He gives them different languages so they can't understand each other anymore. That's the beginning of the Bible. Isn't that weird? That's a weird start to this story, okay? Then, in Genesis 12, we turn the page, God appears to yet another man. This man's name is Abram, and this is where our story today picks up. So, Genesis 12, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. This moment is one of the most important turning points in the entire Bible. It lays a foundation for everything that comes after it. And so we're going to spend our time today looking at 5 parts of this story, okay? The man, the mission, the purpose, the assurance, and the response. That's where we're going. So let's start with this man, this guy, Abram. God shows up to him, kind of out of nowhere. Now, common thread in the Bible, even just from the last couple of minutes recapping the story, is God chooses oftentimes to put someone at the center of some plan that he has. So at the beginning, he makes Adam and Eve. He says, you guys are the king and queen of creation. He commissions them, right? But soon things go naked and sideways, and that's take one. And then he chooses Noah, this new guy, one person at the center of the plan. God says, oh, you're the righteous remnant, the only one who's left. I'm going to choose you as the one through whom I'm going to restart this plan. And things go naked and sideways, and that's take 2. And then God chooses this man named Abram. And at this point, we're like, okay, here it is. God choosing another person to put at the center, and it's time for another reset. This is take 3. And here's something fascinating about this story. Do you know why God chose this man, Abram, as the center of this new story? I went to seminary, done a lot of work on this. Here's my official seminary answer. I have no idea. Okay? I cannot figure this out. I've read scholars on this, and there's nothing apparently about Abram's story that makes him an obvious choice for this plan. It's part of what makes Genesis so strange. Many of the stories that we know, even in pop culture, have a sort of chosen one at the center of the story. And there's almost always a sort of rationale for why they are uniquely positioned to do what no one else can. That's why they're the chosen one. And so we've got stories like Harry Potter, right? And he's the one who was attacked as a baby, and he's the boy who lived, right? And so he's the one who can defeat Lord Voldemort. And then there's Luke Skywalker, who's got Jedi stuff running through his veins, and he happens to be Darth Vader's son, right? He's uniquely positioned. And I don't know if you know about this is true, but our only senior pastor, Ian Simpkins, was recently signed on by Zondervan with a book deal, okay? These are our heroes, okay? These are the people we know and love, not that we deserve. When it comes to Abram, there's none of this. There is no origin story. There is no book deal. He's not particularly righteous. In fact, one of the only glimpses we get into Abram's background comes in Joshua 24. Joshua said to all the people, he's kind of recapping their story for them. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River, and they what? Worshipped other gods. That's Abram's background. But, God says, I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. Abram brings nothing to the table. He's a nobody from nowhere. He himself is an outsider in the story who's brought in. If Abraham had a resume, it would be blank except for maybe one line, which is this: God chose me. This is why this is important. You here today, your lack of qualifications does not disqualify you from being used by God in big ways. In fact, as we look at the story of the Bible, God often chooses people precisely because they are the most unassuming. They're the least qualified. The Apostle Paul puts it this way. He says, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things. That's who God chooses. But even though lots of us are taught this, we sort of know it on some level, we can tend to resort back to, on our good days, thinking that God chose us because there's something awesome in us. So we occasionally need to be reminded, right? Moses stood before Israel on a day where he thought, I think you need to be reminded of where you come from. He says this: the Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord, what? Loved you. Friend, the power of your story is rooted not in what you can offer God, but rather in God's love for you. Never forget that. That is what will get you through the good days and the bad days. If you are feeling here today like there's nothing special about you, that maybe you're just a little too vanilla or unqualified, your resume is a little too blank, remember that God chose Abram, this outsider, as the man through whom he would change the world. God can do extraordinary things through ordinary people. So that's the man at the center of this. And now the mission that he gives him. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. A few things to note about the mission that God gives Abram here that is true broadly of how kind of God operates throughout Scripture and maybe true of how God is working in your story right now, all right? First, when God calls, it often means letting go of what is comfortable. Do you notice here? Go from your country, your people, and your father's household. This is a calling that came at great cost. This was a calling that would leave behind family and safety nets and everything familiar. This was not just shifting zip codes. This was starting over for Abram. Obedience for Abram was not convenient. It was the exact opposite. It was very, very costly. Saying yes would be to leave behind a whole lot and to step into vulnerability. Second, when God calls, it often means starting the journey without knowing the destination. You catch this? Look at what God says. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to where? The land I'll show you. Can you imagine receiving that as your marching orders? Where is the address that Abram is going to plug into Google Maps here? Like, there isn't one. He does not know where he's going. God doesn't give the details up front, and yet he starts walking anyway. Trust is taking that first step to walk in obedience even when you don't know the destination. Many of us want a sort of flashlight faith where we can look far ahead when God has given us a sort of lantern faith. Said, there's the next step. Will you take it? And third, when God calls, it often means breaking cultural norms and generational cycles. Abram's call, if you know the story, wasn't just about starting something new. It was actually about finishing something that his father had started before him. Here's what I mean. God would eventually reveal that the land that he was going to show him was a land called Canaan. It was a land that would become known as the Promised Land. But at the end of chapter 11, just before this passage, we're told something surprising. Okay? verse 31 in chapter 11. Terah, this is Abram's son, father, took his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to where? Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they, say it, settled there. I want to show a map just because we are not super familiar with these areas. This is Ur. This is where Abram's family and Terah, his dad, was from. And he had a destination in mind, Canaan. And he set out from there, but he doesn't get more than halfway. Something happens. We're not told what. And he settles in a place called Haran. What's fascinating is this was actually a journey west in a world that was always pushing east. When Adam and Eve sinned and were exiled from the garden, they went east. When Cain killed his brother Abel, he wandered east. When the people were looking for a place to build their Tower of Babel, they were wandering east. And then there's this guy, Terah, who says, guess what? I'm going to go west. If you're reading carefully, you go, something is shifting here in the story. It's a little mysterious, but there's a glimmer of hope that this downward spiral might have a change coming. So that's how Genesis 11 ends. It's an unfinished story. And so when God calls Abram in Genesis 12, he's not actually starting something brand new. He's picking up where Terah's story stopped. Abram is called to break the pattern, to go where his father wouldn't. So as you sit here today, maybe some questions to wrestle with. Where are you clinging to comfort instead of walking in obedience? Some of you know that God is asking you to do something in particular, but to do that thing would mean letting go of something, and that would be costly. But instead of walking in obedience, you're clinging to that thing. Is it possible that that thing, or maybe that person that you're clinging to, is the very thing that's holding you back in taking steps of faith? How about this? Where are you refusing to take a step of obedience because the destination is not clear? Are you demanding a flashlight when God wants you to use the lantern that he has given you to take the next step? He often shows us just enough ahead for us to take a step forward and then trust him that he'll be there for us tomorrow to give us the next step. That kind of journey may not feel efficient, but I tell you what, it will build intimacy. When we don't have all of the answers, it keeps us close to the one who does. And how about this? Where are you stuck right now in your life in patterns that you've inherited, but patterns that need to be broken? Are you drifting eastward in these currents because that's just always the way it's been? It's all you've ever known. It's what your friends are doing. It's where the family that you have come from. Where might God be calling you to reverse direction, to blaze a new trail? Maybe it is a family pattern that you've inherited. It's a sort of toxic trait that came from mom or dad, something that you grew up with, and all of a sudden, now that you're older, your friends, your family are seeing that in you. Maybe it's just like spiritual apathy. Maybe it's just letting go of Bible, scripture time, settling for a shallow faith. Where do you need to say, that pattern stops with me? We saw this on display in a huge way last Sunday. I don't know if you were here. 77 people got baptized between here and our Columbia campus. It was a phenomenal weekend. 77 people said, Jesus has saved me and offered me a better way. 77 people got in the water to say, in a world that is screaming east, I will plant my foot, turn around, and start going west. That is sacrifice that often comes at a cost for the sake of mission. But we're seeing it happen right here in our midst. The mission God gives Abram is to go from everything he's ever known to a land that he would show him. But that still leaves the question, why? Why is he being called to go? What's the purpose for the mission? That's what we find out next. God says, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation. And I will bless you, and I will make your name great. That sounds pretty awesome. The purpose of the mission is you're going to have an awesome name. You're going to become a great nation. But I want you to notice a contrast between that in Genesis 12 and what we see in chapter 11, this Tower of Babel scene. The people at Babel say, let us build a city so that we may make a name for who? For ourselves. They wanted greatness, but it was a self-serving greatness. It was fueled by pride, and God responded by scattering them. But you turn just a few verses later to the next chapter, and God shows up to this unknown outsider and says, hey, I'm going to make your name great. Did you see the contrast there? The people who were trying to make their own name great were humbled. And this guy who brought nothing to the table, God approaches him and says, I'm going to lift you up. Isn't that true of how we see God operate so often? There is a Babel in every single one of our hearts. We work and hustle to earn applause and build platforms and prove our worth to the world, gain accolades and followers. And it starts early. When I ask my boys these days, what do you want to be when you grow up? It used to be like firefighter, astronaut. You know what it is these days? Famous YouTuber. Like, why? So people can watch me unwrapping toys and playing with Legos, and I can have lots of followers. And that's not a knock on them. This is a glimpse. It's like my boys hold up a mirror to me oftentimes, right? It's a glimpse into every single one of our own hearts. We all want to matter. We all want to be seen. We chase greatness because we think that therein lies satisfaction. But here's the question I want you to sit with today. Are you striving to achieve what God is already freely offering you? A few weeks ago, I sat down with a guy who, his marriage has been just falling apart in this last season. He's in the music industry, and he has found himself just pouring everything he is into his career. And it's come at the expense of his wife and his kids. And I looked at him, I said, why are you killing the people who are most in your corner, who love you the most, your family? And in a really honest moment, he said, it's because I'm an addict. I'm addicted to applause. And if I stop what I'm doing and the applause stops, I won't know who I am anymore. And that's a pretty shocking thing to hear somebody say. But then I realized he's just naming something that is a part of all of us that we're just too afraid to say out loud over coffee. Like that I'm afraid to say out loud over coffee. And as we got talking further, I realized that a lot of his insecurity and these issues that he's dealing with are tied back to his relationship with his dad. He said, I've never heard my dad say the words, I'm proud of you. And he goes, you know what? I never will. Because I know that nothing I ever do will ever be good enough for him. And he goes, but I don't know how to stop trying to get him to say those words. I can't stop trying. And I looked at this guy and I said, brother, God has already spoken over you the words that you are longing for your earthly father to hear. And his voice matters so much more than your earthly father's. So much more. The Babel in every single one of our hearts says, hey, let me make my name great. But that impulse, like this guy, will bulldoze what is beautiful in your life if you let it run free. The Abram story shows this, that God actually delights in showing up to a nobody and saying, you don't have to hustle for a name. I will give it to you freely as a gift of grace. And unlike Babel, this name that Abram is given is not to glorify him. It is for the sake of others. Look at what God says. He said, I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And you will be a blessing. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. You see how Abram is a conduit here. This is why our mission here at the Bridge is to be with Jesus and become like him for the sake of the world. When God blesses somebody, it's our conviction that it is never just for them. It is always to be a blessing to others. Always. Now, this whole promise that God approaches Abraham with is astonishing. It sounds incredible, right? There is one gaping problem right at the center of this plan, though. Here it is. It's at the end of chapter 11, this small detail that we're told. Sarai, who's Abram's wife, was childless because she was not able to conceive. The name Abram, if you didn't know, means exalted father. Exalted father. Now, can you imagine carrying that name your whole life. Parents give it to you, you grow up, you fall in love, get married, you try to have kids, you keep trying to have kids, and the months turn into years, and those years grow long. And all the while, every time somebody calls out your name, exalted Father, you remember this thing in your life that is a huge source of pain. And then God shows up and says, through your offspring, I'm going to bless everyone on earth. Just to add to the impossibility of this situation, Abram is 75 years old when God finds him and makes this promise. 75. And you fast forward a few chapters, and Abram is suddenly 99 years old and still has no children. And it's at this point that God shows up again and says, hey, your name is no longer going to be Abram, exalted father. You're going to get a name change. Abe thinks maybe God is going to go back on his promise. Maybe it's been too long for me. And God says, your name is now going to be Abraham, which means father of many. God is doubling down on this thing that he has promised, this impossible thing. Now imagine having to go tell your community, hey, I have a new name at 99 years old. It means the father of many. And you have not one child. What would you have thought in that moment? What would you have felt to walk in that community? Some of you today don't need to imagine that. You're walking Abram's journey. You are walking the journey of infertility, wanting a child. And it hasn't happened. This would have touched a big nerve for Abram. This was an area of deep pain, deep insecurity. And yet God says, it's exactly the point at which I'm going to start redeeming your story. I don't know who needs to hear this today, but maybe it is you. Your greatest pain might be the soil where God plants your greatest purpose. We see it happen all of the time. The thing that you're most discouraged by, most ashamed of, the thing that you're convinced most disqualifies you, just might be the very thing that God uses to show his power through you. Abram was 99 years old when his story got traction. 99 years old. If you are still breathing, God is not done writing your story. Despite the odds, despite the insecurity, despite all of this that made this seem impossible, this was Abram's response. So Abram went as the Lord told him. He went. The man with the blank resume starts a journey that would change the world because even without qualifications or degrees or experience, he does have one thing, and that is a willingness to say yes when God calls. But his story isn't over. His faith, however strong on that day, where he starts walking, starts to waver, and Abram begins questioning God. How does God respond to this wavering faith? It's actually not with a reprimand. He responds with assurance, and he does it in a really surprising way. So if you flip ahead to Genesis 15, you'll see Abram wrestling with this promise. God had said, hey, you'll become a great nation, and here he is, still childless. And so God hears Abram say, what is all this about? And God says, come out of your tent. And he brings him out of his tent. It's nighttime. He says, look up at the sky. You see the stars. See how many there are. That's how many your descendants will be. And then picking up at verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? I love this passage because it is honest about what I find is true in my own heart so often. That when I hear a promise that God is making, part of me says, I believe. And the other part of me says, yeah, but how will I know? How can I really know? That's the kind of honesty that we see right here in Scripture. And God responds to this wrestling not just with grace, not even just with mere words. He responds with a covenant ceremony. Okay, so verse 9. The Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. Anybody have this stitched on a pillow at home? It's not... Nobody? This is a weird scene, is it not? We read this and we're like, what is happening here in the scene? But this would have made all the sense in the world to Abram. This was a common ceremony between two people who would make an agreement in the ancient world. If you wanted to insist to somebody, I will uphold my commitment to you, then you might do exactly what you see here. You take two animals, cut them in half, line up the halves opposite each other, create this sort of aisle down the middle, and then you would walk down the aisle. And by doing that, this is what you mean. If I break my promise to you, my covenant with you, may what has happened to these animals happen to me. It's a way to say, I promise on my life, I'll keep my end of the bargain. And what you expect is for both parties of the covenant to walk through, for both of them to say, I promise on my life. But that's not what happens. Look at verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared. So this is God showing up in the form of fire, as he often does in Scripture. This blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. You notice who doesn't walk down the aisle? It's Abram. God walks this alone. So don't miss this. He is saying, if this promise is broken, either by me or by you, let the consequences fall on me. This is the scandal of the grace of God. This is God saying, I will take the full weight of this promise on myself. Now, spoiler alert, Abram would go on to have a child. He would go on to become a great nation, but eventually this nation, called Israel, would fall into the old pattern of settling, of becoming bent inward, of failing to uphold their end of the covenant. So there's this tension in the Old Testament. What is God going to do with a people who can't uphold their end of the deal? He keeps the covenant anyway. Generations later, another child would be born. It was a descendant of Abram. This child would also go west in a world that pulled eastward. His name would be Jesus. He would be the true and better Abram, the true ultimate outsider who would leave his father's house and everything that was comfortable and step into creation so that he could bring outsiders home. At the cross, we see God fulfilling the covenant that we see here in Genesis chapter 15. Literally, Jesus becomes the broken body. He says, if it takes my death to keep this promise, then so be it. And so at the cross, God keeps his end of the covenant, and he keeps ours too. The author of life dies for us. The giver of the promised land dies in it at the hands of those he gave it to, all so he can keep his word, to bring blessing to the whole world. So what does this mean for us? How should we respond? If God has kept the promise that we haven't and can't, if he has made a way for outsiders like us to come home, then we can take a couple cues from Abram as we finish here. I've already said it. Genesis 15:6, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This, friends, is the heart of the gospel. We don't earn. We don't climb. We don't make a name for ourselves. In fact, we don't make a name at all. Instead, we are called to trust in a name, the name that is above every other name. The invitation is to put our faith in Jesus, his finished work for us, his life for us, his death for us, his resurrection for us. And when we do that, this great exchange happens as he takes all of our sin and penalty and we get his righteousness. And so if you've never done that, if you've never actually stepped out of striving and into trusting and believing, make today the day that you do that. Stop striving and enter through the door that God has shown you in Christ. Second response is just important. This is the response in Genesis 12:4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. And so he didn't just believe, he obeyed. And like Abram, like Jesus, we too are sent to live open-handedly, to let go of comfort for the sake of calling, to break cycles that we may have inherited, to go even when we don't know where the road ends, all so that we can bring blessing to the world to make sure that no outsider is under the impression that they are outside of God's plan of redemption. Friends, God has invited us in. So may we be faithful to go out to share the news that others are invited to.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on our YouTube channel today. I hope that you felt the welcome home of Christ right through your screen. Here we believe that the gospel is good news worth sharing. So if you'd like to share this stream with your friends and family, you can also subscribe to this channel and you can use @BridgeChurchTN. Also, if you'd like to give, there's a link in the description there you can click and it'll walk you through all the steps. And if you'd like to stay connected with us, you can simply head on over to bridge.tv. Hope to see you again soon.